The night she ran into that forest, she had no afige, she had no idea she would not come out the same person, and the thing waiting for her in the dark. It was not what she feared. It was something far more complicated than that. She hadn't planned any of it. She hadn't planned any of it. The weather is really nice. That was the part that haunted her most when she looked back. The way the worst and most transformative nights of a person's life never announced themselves. Mara had driven 4 hours from the city with nothing but a half-charged phone, a bag of gas station food, and the specific kind of emotional exhaustion that doesn't come from too little sleep, but from too many years of holding yourself together with nothing left underneath. The rental cabin was supposed to be a reset. 3 days alone, no notifications, no people, no one needing anything from her. She had earned that. She had survived the kind of year that quietly dismantles a person. A relationship that ended not with fire but with silence. A job that had consumed her without nourishing her. A grief she hadn't let herself name yet, following her mother's passing 6 months before. She was not running away. She was retreating, which felt different. She was really nice, though she couldn't have explained how. The cabin existed at the end of a gravel road deep in the Black Pine Wilderness Reserve, surrounded by Douglas fir trees, so tall they erased the sky, and she had found it through a small rental listing with 4 photographs and no reviews. That should have told her something. But she had clicked book anyway, because something in those 4 photographs, the dark wood walls, the cast iron fireplace, the single chair facing a window full of trees, had looked like the inside of a place that could hold her without asking anything in return. She arrived at dusk. She built a fire. She ate crackers and cheese standing at the kitchen counter because the table felt too large for one person. She went to bed early and slept heavily and did not dream, which was the first real sleep she'd had in months. And then, at some hour deep in the night, when the fire had reduced itself to orange coals, and the cabin had gone cold and silent, and she woke to the sound of the doors all day. She woke because sound didn't swinging open, not because someone had turned the handle, but because the latch had not caught properly, and the wind had found it. She lay still for a moment, listening to the door knock softly against the frame, for that she simply needed to get up. Shall Dewey get up and close it? Listening herself to Dewey doing to close it, that there was no reason for the cold spreading through her chest. But then she heard it. Not the wind, not the branches. Something low and rhythmic and animal coming from just beyond the tree line. A sound that was not quite a growl and not quite a breath, but existed somewhere between the two, patient and enormous and close. She was out of bed before she decided to move. Her feet hit the cold floor. Her hand found her phone on the nightstand, and she did the thing that every reasonable person tells themselves they will never do in a horror story. She went toward the open instead of a woe story. She went toward the open door instead of away from it, because the alternative was staying inside a cabin whose walls suddenly felt very thin, because some part of her, the part that had spent 6 months feeling like she was already disappearing, needed to know what was real and what was fear. She stepped onto the porch. The moon was high and full and indifferent, painting the clearing silver. And the trees beyond the clearing were black shapes against a sky crowded with stars she never saw in the city. Seplaus she never saw in the city. She could hear her own breathing. She could hear her own breathing. She could hear the pine needles shifting in the wind. And then the growling stopped, which was somehow worse than when it had been continuous, because silence after a sound like that does not mean safety. It means something is listening. That does not mean safety. It means something's taken back. It means something is listening back. She took one step off the porch into the grass, and that was when her phone buzzed in her hand. A single notification. Does a new notification. Signal briefly connecting to some distant tower. It is screen some distant tower. And in the half-second, she looked down at the screen. The trees at the edge of the clearing parted, and the beast appeared. It was large. That was the first thing her mind registered, because large was something she could face. Because large was something she could process. It moved through the tree line on 4 legs but rose as it cleared the brush. And in the moonlight it was a shouldn't have existed. And in the moonlight it was a shape that shouldn't have existed. Shouldn't have been standing 20 meters away in a wilderness reserve in the modern world. Massive shoulders, dark fur, a face that was neither fully wolf nor fully anything else she had a name for, and eyes that caught the moonlight and held it, burning an amber in the dark. She should have run. Every muscle in her body understood this. But her legs had locked, and her breath had stopped, and the creature stood at the edge of the clearing and looked at her with those amber eyes. And it did not charge. It did not growl again. It simply stood there and breathed, the great slow heave of its chest, visible even across the distance, watching her the way something watches when it is deciding. And Mara thought with strange clarity. It's thinking, which was the wrong thing to think, because thinking creatures are more dangerous than instinctive ones. But also, in a way she couldn't justify, more interesting. She took a step backward toward the porch. The creature's head moved, tracking her, but its feet did not. She took another step. It still did not follow. She reached the porch steps, climbed them without looking away, backed through the open door, and pulled it shut, locked behind her, she with both hands, holding the handle from the inside, as though that would make any difference at all, against something that size. She stood in the dark of the cabin and waited. Nothing came. No body against the door. No sound of movement outside. After what felt like a very long time, she heard it again. Not a growl this time, but something lower and stranger, almost musical in its resonance, like the sound a cello makes in a space with no other instruments, reverberating through the walls and into her, in sternum. And then silence again, total and complete, and she did not sleep for the rest of the night. Morning arrived slowly, as it does in forests, the light filtering through the trees rather than striking them, everything dim and green and damp with the night's exhalation. Mara had sat in the chair by the window with a blanket and her cold phone until the sky outside changed color, and when dawn finally made the clearing visible, she pressed her face against the glass and looked at Glista changed the gizzos, and looked at the spot where the creature had stood. The grass was flattened there. The edge of the tree line showed broken branches at shoulder height. Shoulder height. Her shoulders, she realized, not whatever it measured against. They were the branches she would have broken walking through, which meant it had come from inside the forest, not through the brush, but along a path. Something with a... She thought about that. She thought about leaving, loading her bag into the car, and driving back to the city before any of the reasons she'd come here could catch up with her. And then she thought about the year she'd had, and about the expression on the creature's face, and she stayed. Because the truth was, she had stopped believing that safety was something she could reach by moving toward it. Sometimes you found out more by holding still. She made coffee and stood at the window and waited to see if it would come back in daylight. It didn't. But around mid-morning, when she'd finally convinced herself to put on boots and walk to the small creek she'd noticed on the rental listings map. 3 minutes east of the cabin, the description said, "Lovely for reflection." She found something at the tree line. She found something at the tree line, not the creature, but evidence of it. A deer, large and recently dead, laid at the base of a pine tree, just inside the forest's edge. Not positioned, not shinned, the way a deer falls when something kills it for food. Positioned. And she knew that word was wrong, knew it was the kind of thing you said when you were beginning to build a story around something that might not deserve one. Positioned with its legs folded beneath it. Two suits slits, like it had been placed there deliberately, like someone had carried it to this spot and set it down with a kind of care. There was something else, too. Beside the deer, sitting on a flat rock, was a piece of broken pine bark with several dark berries arranged on it. The same berries she had been staring at on the trail the day before, wondering if they were the edible. She had wondered out loud, alone, the way you do when there's no one to hear you. But something had heard her. She stood at the tree line for a long time, with her hands in her jacket pockets and her heart beat loud in her ears. For us. Then she went back inside and locked the door, not because locking it made sense, but because the gesture gave her hands something to do. That afternoon, she found herself doing something she had not expected. She sat at the small table and wrote. Not anything organized, just the shapes of what she was feeling, the way the night had looked, the amber color of those eyes, the impossible gentleness of a deer, placed like an offering. She wrote about her mother, which she had not done since the funeral, and about the apartment she'd go back to that still had your mother's voice on the voicemail, that still had her mother's voice on the voicemail she couldn't bring herself to delete, and about how grief sits differently in a forest than it does in a city. Heavier, but somehow more breathable, like weather instead of a wound. She was still writing when the light changed, and she looked up to find the clearing going gold with late afternoon, and she looked toward late afternoon, and she realized she had not thought about leaving since morning. She heard it again that evening, just after dark, Not the growl this time, not the cello sound, but something closer to breathing, slow and deliberate, just outside the cabin's eastern wall. She picked up the lantern she'd found in the closet, lit it, and carried it to the window. The amber eyes were already there, watching her through the glass from a distance of perhaps 5 feet, the great dark shape of the creature visible in the lantern's yellow halo. Seuled in olding, he no sew. Ooh. Her heart lurched. Her breath caught. But she did not step back. And neither did it. They stayed like that for almost the other. Her on one side, after a minute in the quality side of the glass. And in that minute, something shifted in the quality of the silence between them. In that the way silence shifts when two people who have been pretending to ignore each other finally stop pretending. Nor ever, dacious, day. She pressed one hand flat against the cold glass. She didn't know why. She did it. It wasn't a decision. The creature's gaze dropped to her hand, then rose again to her face, and this was the thing that followed her into sleep that night and into every day after. It lifted one enormous paw and the glaxed into claws. Hellos pressed it against the glass on the other sides. In your chestes, so on the other side of her hand. Not aggressive, not threatening. Deliberate and careful and terrifyingly gentle. She exhaled. The glass fogged slightly from her breath, and the creature's eyes, holding hers through that fogged glass, were not the eyes of something that had been hers fogged too for a very long time. They were the eyes of ein thing that wanted to hurt her. They with ein is the creature of something that had been alone for a very long time. She woke the next morning with a decision already formed in her mind, the way decisions sometimes are when you've made them in your sleep, without realizing it. She was going to open the door, not flung open, not an invitation to danger, but opened just enough, because whatever was happening in that clearing had moved past the category of threat and into the category of mystery, and Mara had spent enough of her life avoiding mysteries to know that avoidance never actually protected her from anything. Miliwas it evtus dio is chenjus angis quafude. She made coffee first. She sat with it and thought about whether she was being reckless or whether reckless and brave had simply learned to wear each other's faces. Then she went to the door and opened it 12 inches and stood inside it and waited. 20 minutes passed. The forest breathed around her. A woodpecker drilled somewhere in the canopy, and then, at the edge of the clearing, the creature materialized from the trees, not suddenly, not dramatically, but gradually. Gradually, the way fog appears, as though it had always been there, and the light was only now making it visible. How are you do the reader? It was even larger in daylight. The fur was dark brown rather than black. She could see now, shot through with threads of silver, and the face was more complicated than it had appeared in the moonlight. Broader, with something in its expression that she kept wanting to give a human name, and kept stopping herself from naming, and kept stopping herself from naming. It crossed the clearing, slowly, not directly toward her, angled slightly, giving her the opportunity to close the door if she needed to, which she recognized as a deliberate accommodation. How was this Follispores, which made her chest tighten with something she couldn't categorize. Whether the real chest, it stopped 8 feet from the porch and sat back on its haunches, watching her with those amber eyes in the morning light. The loathing today to us begs to chain was seen, she said, very quietly. Are you the one who left the deer? She felt foolish the moment the words left her, but the creature's ears rotated toward her voice, and something in its posture, the slight relaxation of the enormous the shape of shoulders. Samtisip Mirinis suggested, Riedius, of unaiti shi din shin saipochoastchen. I didn't eat it, she said. I didn't know if I was supposed to. The creature made a sound she hadn't heard before, low and brief, nothing like the growl, nothing like the cello resonance, something shorter, antba, and almost questioning. She felt, absurdly, like she was being corrected. All right, she said, thank you. For the deer. And the berries, if that was you too. Another sound, slightly different, briefer. She was going to lose her mind, she thought. She was going to stand here interpreting the sounds of a creature and nature's her that had no obligation to make sense to her and invent a whole language out of wishful thinking. But then it stood again and turned and walked back toward the tree line and paused at the edge and looked back at her over its shoulder. Understood. She understood that, at least. She grabbed her jacket from the hook beside the door. What followed was 3 hours, trying explain to her life, trying to could not be nigh. Who are you been there? To be denied today. Wati tukini bies dinenai. It walked ahead of her. Not so far ahead that she felt abandoned. Not so close that she felt herded. Through the forest, along what she gradually recognized it, was a path. Faint and ancient, the kind of path made by consistent passage over a long period of time. It showed her things. A spring she would never have found on her own. So clear that the bottom was visible 3 feet down on. Cold enough to ache when she dipped her hand in. A cedar tree so old its trunk had grown into an archway over the trail, its interior hollowed by years into something that felt, when she ducked through it, like a threshold. A clearing she didn't have words for, small and circular, and floored with a carpet of moss so dense and uniform. It looked maintained, surrounded by birch trees, whose white bark caught the filtered light and turned it silver. She sat in that clearing for a long time without thinking about anything specific, which was a kind of gift she hadn't known she needed. There, and the creature sat across from her at the clearing's edge, and watched and watched her rest with an attention that felt, she couldn't stop using the wrong words for it, felt like guardianship. She told it about her mother in that clearing. She hadn't planned to. She just started talking the way you talk to a fire or a river when there's no one else, not expecting response, just needing the words outside her body instead of inside. She talked about the voicemail. She talked about the way her mother used to narrate cooking as though she were hosting her own private show. The sound effects, the commentary, the invented disasters that were actually perfect meals. She talked about the specific quality of missing someone who had been your first audience for everything. How the world your first audience for everything, how fitting the world went at slightly hollow without that one consistent witness. The creature was still the whole time she talked. It did not move toward her or away. Its eyes stayed on her face, And when she finished and the silence came back, the one before she had came back, it was a different, some kind of silence, dinat to shiniting chend, before she too had spoken. Fuller, somehow, as though she had added something to it that would stay. She learned things about it in stages, the way you learn things about anyone. Its injuries, first. She noticed the way it favored its left front leg on the return walk. A subtle hitch its gait, that it seemed to be managing with long practice, is to tsudi. To it doing sudi, to it to the chid, to it doing to it doors, it long practiced us. She noticed 3 parallel scars running from its shoulder to its ribs, old and silvered, the kind that had healed wrong. She noticed that when she slowed her pace to match its careful limping, it did not protest, did not speed up to prove. The leg was fine. It simply accepted her adjustment, which told her it was either past pride or had never had the human version of it. She noticed the other thing, too. The way it positioned itself on the on the uphill side of the path she might trail banked, which put its body between her and any slope she might slide on. The way it paused at every trail junction and waited for her to orient before proceeding. The way its ears moved constantly, sweeping for sounds, and how twice it had stopped entirely, and she'd learned to stop too, and they'd stood together in total stillness until whatever had moved in the undergrowth moved away. It was protecting her. That was the word she kept refusing and then returning to. Protecting. Not from itself. For her. She didn't know what to do with that. Back at the cabin, she cleaned the injury she'd identified on its leg. It allowed her to, sitting at the porch's edge while she docked out the first aid pin under the sink while you daving pin its sint, finting the scenery. The first aid kit she'd found under the sink was holding absolutely still while she cleaned the area around an embedded thorn with antiseptic she'd dilute in wadig. She'd dilute it in water because the concentration seemed too harsh, watching her with an expression she could only describe as patient tolerance, the look of something accepting, help it didn't strictly need, but was choosing not to refuse. She worked slowly. Her hands were steady in a way they hadn't been since her mother got sick. When she finished, it examined her work briefly, then made the short, low sound she was beginning to think of as acknowledgement. Wednesday, and she felt a warmth in her chest that embarrassed her slightly because of how straightforward and immediate. The warmth of straightforward, the warmth of having helped something uncomplicated and immediate. You've been alone a long time, she said quietly. Not really. Not really to it, or maybe entirely to it. It turned its head and looked at her with the amber eyes. She looked back. So have I, she said. I didn't think I was. I had people. I was very busy. But she stopped. The creature waited. Busy isn't the same thing, she finished. It lowered its head slowly until its chin rested near her knee, not touching, still that careful maintained distance, and exhaled. Ebolong onto a long, slow breath that she felt against her leg. She stayed on the porch until the stars appeared. The trouble came on her third night, as trouble tends to, not from where she'd been looking, not from the forest or not from the creature or the strangeness of the whole situation, but from the road. A vehicle, headlights cutting through the trees shortly after midnight, moving too fast for the gravel. She heard it before she saw it. She was already standing at the window when the truck pulled into the clearing and two men got out. Rangers, she thought at first, then reconsidered as she registered the rifles and the equipment that was not standard ranger equipment. Today, she recognized the word on their truck only when one of them turned in the headlights. Wildlife control. The creature was somewhere in the trees behind the cabin. She knew this the way she'd learned to know where it was, the particular quality of the forest's attention when it was nearby. Willie's nearby, and she knew with a certainty that hit her clean and cold that these men had not come here on a routine patrol. Someone had reported something. Someone had been in these woods in the past few days. A hiker, another renter, someone with a trail camera, and these men had come to deal with it. She stepped outside before she knew she was moving. The men startled when they saw her. A woman on the porch at midnight in a winter jacket, which was not what they'd expected. The taller one lowered his rifle slightly. "Ma'am, you need to go back inside." "I live here," she said, which wasn't true in any real sense, but felt truer than most true things. "We've had reports of a large animal, dangerous, possibly injured. We're here to remove it." "There's nothing here," she said. Her voice was very steady. She was not a good liar in her normal life, but something in her chest had clarified to a single point. "And from that here 3 days, I've walked point," she spoke. I've walked every trail. There's nothing unusual in this forest." The shorter man was scanning the tree line with a light, and she willed herself to kriken she knew the creature was. The shortenist is really herself not to look in the direction she knew the creature was, not to give anything away with her eyes. "We have visual confirmation," the taller man said. "Trail camera, 2 nights ago." "A deer," she said. "Large one. I saw it too. It's gone now." A long pause. She held the taller man's gaze until he looked away first, which she filed away as information about herself. That she could do that. That she had it in her. When it mattered. The shorter man's light swept past the tree line once more and found nothing, because the creature had understood. Somehow, in its long experience of being hunted, how to not be found. After another minute, the men exchanged a look she couldn't read. And the taller one said, "Stay inside at night, ma'am," in the tone of someone who hadn't gotten what they came for. And they got back in the truck and drove away, and the red taillights disappeared around the bend of the road, and the clearing went dark again. And Mara stood on the porch with her knees shaking and her hands at her sides. The creature appeared at the tree line 30 seconds later. It crossed the clearing faster than she'd seen it move before. Not limping now, the full control contour of it visible in it moved before, in the Chalem-controlled power visible in the way the moonlight tracked its movement. And it stopped at the base of the porch steps and looked up at her. She looked down at it. She was shaking, and she didn't bother hiding it. "They'll come back," she said, "or others like them, you know that." It looked at her steadily. "You can't stay here," she said. And then, because she'd been turning a thing over in her mind, since she'd found the path, since she'd sat in the circular clearing about that geography, and felt something ancient and sorcuduavary, mixed in the biosis to biorchur icheg. Hello, but I think you know somewhere they can't follow. It held her gaze. It als Derekin for having for a moment longer. Then it turned and looked at the forest, and then back at her. And she thought of every moment in the past 3 days. The glass and the paw and the spring and the cedar arch and the voicemail she still hadn't deleted. And she said, very quietly, "Show me." She packed only what fit in her day bag. She ducked the chain to it, left the cabin unlocked, because it seemed right. She followed the creature into the forest and the trees. The column was behind her, and the moonlight led them deeper in columns, and the path led them deeper than she'd gone before, past the spring and the cedar arch and the circular clearing and beyond. And she did not feel afraid. She felt the way she'd felt as a child before she'd learned to translate everything into risk. Open and present and moving through the world without bracing for it. The creature stayed close now, closer than it had on any of their other walks. Its shoulder occasionally near her hand, not quite contact, but the air between them so thin it was nearly the same thing. They walked for a long time. The forest changed around them. Older, quieter. The undergrowth disappearing as the canopy thickened, and the trees grew larger as the canopy thickened, and the trees grew larger than anything she'd seen in the reserve. Edafudi Yenikve. Trees that had been standing before the idea of a wildlife reserve existed. Trees that had watched centuries of noise and human decisions-making and had simply continued being trees, unconcerned. And then the path opened into something she had no framework for. A valley, small and steep-sided, invisible from above, floored with grass green. It seemed lit from underneath. A stream at its center, the walls of it dense with old growth that would shelter anything inside it, from sight, from sound, from the casual violence of the world above. She stood at the lip of the valley and understood. This was where it had always gone when the world became too much. Evridimicha, this was the kept secret of it, the retreat at the retreat's name on any map. It stood beside her and looked down at the valley, and then at her, and in its expression. She had stopped apologizing to herself for reading its expressions, was something she recognized with her whole body. The specific vulnerability of showing someone the place you go to survive. She had done that too, in smaller ways. The 4 photographs, the unlisted cabin, the chair facing the window full of trees. We all have a valley, she thought. We all have a place we go when the noise becomes unbearable. The lucky ones find someone worth showing it to. She stayed 3 more days. She called the rental company from the one spot in the valley where signal reached and extended her booking. She slept under the old trees in the warmth she wouldn't have expected and didding under Quachi, and woke each morning to the amber light of a creature who had decided, for reasons she would spend years turning over, to trust her with the thing it had most kept. She told it everything she hadn't told anyone. About the year, about the grief that had settled inside her like sediment, about the version of herself she'd been before her mother died, and the mother Bina, and the version she was now, and the question she'd been carrying of whether those two versions could be reconciled, or whether the second one simply had to become its own person with the first one as a reference point, a starting place that was also before. It listened the way it had always listened, and in the listening it did something she hadn't known she needed. It witnessed her, not fixed her, not fixed her, not reassured her, just stayed present while she was complicated, which is sometimes the only thing that helps. Hagen, every kandan, and she listened to it in return, not in words, but in the way you listen to something wordless when you've stopped needing words to be the only valid language. She learned the sound that meant contented, and the sound that meant alert, and the sound that meant something more ambiguous. Seen some in the range of feeling that didn't have a simple name. She learned that it liked the eastern edge of the valley, in the late afternoon when the light came when the light came horizontal through the gap in the ridge. She learned it was drawn to water the way she was drawn to windows. Not to look at it, but to be near its sound. She learned that three parallel scars were not its only ones, and that it had learned to carry damage quietly, the way living things do when there's no one to show it to. When she finally left, really left, bag in the car, engine running, she stood at the road for a long time, facing the forest. The trees gave nothing away, which was their nature. And also she had come to understand a kind of protection. She thought about going back. She thought about what she was going back to. She thought about the voicemail, and about grief, and about the way the world inside the valley had felt like a frequency she'd forgotten she could tune to. She thought about a creature who had placed a deer by a path and berries on a rock because someone had wondered aloud and been overheard, and who had pressed a paw against cold glass in the dark, and who had walked her to a hidden valley in the old growth and shown her the place it went to survive. An act of trust so enormous and so simply offered that she had not been able to name it at the time, and was only naming it now, alone on a gravel road with the engine running and the trees standing at their ancient indifferent height. She did not delete the voicemail when she got home. But for the first time since her mother had died, she played it. She sat in her apartment with the city going about its business outside the window, and she listened to her mother's voice. "Hello, you've reached Claire. I'm probably in the garden. Leave something lovely." And she cried in a way that was different from all the other times, less like drowning and more like weather, the kind that passes through and leaves the air cleaner. She went to the window after. She looked out at the city, and somewhere behind her sternum, beneath all the familiar weight, there was something that hadn't been there when she'd left, small and amber and secret. The size of a kept secret. Spirits sister, the warmth of having been witnessed. She had gone into that forest carrying everything she hadn't been able to put down. She had come out of it, carrying something new instead. Something she hadn't known she was looking for, which is the only way those things are ever found. Ito di det dek de hen.